The crackle of electricity split the air with a sound so sharp it seemed to freeze time, a vicious snap that tore through the quiet afternoon and turned it into chaos. In that single instant, everything I thought I knew about safety, about control, about the rules that hold a community together, vanished. My wife's scream was ripped from her throat as the prongs of a taser sank into her body convulsing under the cruel surge of voltage. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. Raw pain made audible, terror made flesh. Just feet away, our disabled daughter's voice broke the silence with a cry that pierced deeper than any weapon could, her small hands reaching toward a mother who suddenly collapsed in front of her eyes. The horror in her gaze branded itself into my soul forever. The smell of burnt ozone hung thick, acrid, clinging to the back of my throat, and every breath I took seemed to feed the storm inside me. Neighbors peeked through blinds, doors cracked open down the street, but no one stepped forward. Fear had a way of chaining people in place. All I could see was the figure standing there, taser still clutched in her hand, eyes wild with a mixture of entitlement and rage, as if she believed she had every right to unleash that kind of violence. For years, she had hidden behind bylaws, letters, and fines, tormenting us under the banner of an HOA president's authority. But this was no letter taped to a door, no passive-aggressive warning about lawn height or parking spaces. This was an assault, a declaration of war on my family in the most personal, unforgivable way. In the span of a heartbeat, my world had been reduced to the image of my wife crumpled on the pavement, my daughter screaming, and the neighbor who dared to believe that rules gave her power over lives. The rage that burned in my chest was no longer the anger of a man wronged by harassment or bullying. It was something primal, a protective fury that would not stop until justice was carved into every lie she had built. And as she raised her voice to justify what she had done, Karen had no idea who she was really standing against, no idea of the truth that was about to shatter her world forever. When we first moved into the neighborhood, it felt like a promise of peace we had long been waiting for. The house wasn't the biggest or the most luxurious, but to us it was everything we dreamed of, a place where our daughter could finally grow up surrounded by stability and comfort. The tree-lined streets seemed almost postcard perfect, children riding bikes in the evenings, families grilling in their yards, neighbors waving as you drove past. For a while, it was easy to believe we had finally found our corner of the world where happiness could take root. My wife poured her energy into making the house a home, choosing soft colors for the walls, planting flowers along the front walkway, and finding ways to make sure our daughter always had space to play and feel included. To us, it wasn't just real estate, it was healing. After years of setbacks, hospital visits, and constant worry about our daughter's condition, this home was meant to be a sanctuary. At first, Karen was little more than a name we heard in passing. Other neighbors mentioned her with a nervous laugh, like people who know better than to say too much, but their eyes told the truth. She was someone to avoid. We didn't understand why until the first week after moving in, when a folded paper appeared in our mailbox. It wasn't a welcome card or a kind note. It was a typed letter signed with her name as HOA president, informing us that our trash bins were not aligned properly on collection day. A petty thing, something easy to brush off. But it was the tone, the sharp edge of authority that treated us not as neighbors, but as subjects, that left an impression. My wife tried to laugh it off, saying maybe she was just doing her job, but even then I saw the storm clouds forming on the horizon. Days turned into weeks, and small encounters became more telling. Karen didn't wave when she passed us on the sidewalk. Instead, she glared, eyes narrowing as if measuring our every movement against an invisible list of violations. If our daughter's medical equipment was delivered to the porch, she'd snap pictures from across the street. When my wife set up a small bench under the tree so our daughter could rest outside after therapy, Karen walked over and questioned whether it was approved furniture. The cruelty wasn't loud yet, but it was steady, small pinpricks meant to bleed away comfort over time. Despite this, we tried to stay positive. Our daughter was the center of our world, and she deserved more than endless battles. She was bright, resilient, and carried a smile that could warm even the coldest days, but she also carried a body that betrayed her too often. Watching her fight for every step, every small victory, made us determined to give her as much joy as we could. We told ourselves that Karen's hostility was just noise, something to be endured for the sake of the bigger picture. My wife, ever the optimist, insisted that maybe one day Karen would see our daughter's strength and soften. I wanted to believe her, but I knew better. People like Karen didn't see humanity when they looked at others, they saw control slipping through their fingers. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. The first time Karen confronted us in person was over something as trivial as the height of our grass. She marched across the street without hesitation, clipboard in hand, her words sharp, her posture commanding. "This community has standards," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, as if our existence itself was a violation. I remember my wife standing calmly, trying to reason with her, but Karen wasn't interested in reason. She wanted compliance. That was the moment I realized we weren't just dealing with an unpleasant neighbor. We were facing someone who thrived on intimidation, someone who had crowned herself queen of the block. What we didn't know then was that these small skirmishes were only the beginning. Karen was escalating, and every step she took drew her closer to crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. For us, the neighborhood was meant to be a home. For her, it was a kingdom. And when kingdoms are threatened, rulers lash out. It didn't take long for Karen's fixation with rules to move from quiet hostility into open conflict. What began as nitpicking over trash bins or grass length soon became a steady drumbeat of harassment that targeted every part of our daily life. It was as if she had appointed herself not only as HOA president, but as the supreme authority over how we lived, breathed, and even cared for our daughter. Each week seemed to bring a new letter, typed and stamped with her self-importance, citing some bylaw or clause we had allegedly violated. One morning, it was about the color of the flower pots my wife had placed near the front porch, apparently unapproved shades. Another day, it was about our driveway chalk art, where our daughter had drawn flowers and sunshine as part of her therapy. Karen called it graffiti. For our daughter, it was healing. For Karen, it was criminal. The worst part wasn't the letters, it was the way she delivered them. Sometimes she slipped them into our mailbox under cover of night, as if she were running a covert operation. Other times, she shoved them directly into my wife's hands, her tone dripping with superiority. The message was always the same. We were intruders in a world she controlled, and she would not rest until we either bowed to her authority or broke under the pressure. My wife tried to reason with her, to explain that the chalk drawings were part of our daughter's therapy, or that the medical equipment boxes stacked by the curb were temporary until pickup. Karen never cared. Compassion had no place in her world. Rules mattered more than people. The neighbors knew. Some shook their heads in sympathy, whispering that Karen had run off 3 families before us. Others shrugged and said nothing, too scared to challenge the woman who weaponized the HOA handbook like it was scripture. I could see it in their eyes when they avoided hers in passing. Everyone knew what she was, but no one wanted to be the one to stand up to her. That silence only fueled her, giving her confidence that she could push further, that no one would dare stop her. It wasn't just the letters anymore. Karen started showing up, uninvited, at the worst possible moments. When my wife was unloading groceries, Karen would appear, pointing out that the car had been parked too close to the sidewalk. When our daughter was in the yard, slowly walking with her braces, Karen would scold her for leaving toys outside, even if it was just a ball sitting in the grass. It was harassment wrapped in the illusion of authority, cruelty disguised as community standards. The first real blow came one evening when Karen stormed over about a small ramp I had installed for our daughter. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure to help her get from the driveway to the front door without struggling. Karen stood there, red-faced and trembling with anger, demanding to know if I had filed the proper architectural request forms. She said the ramp wasn't aesthetic, that it would lower property values. My wife's face fell. And my daughter, standing beside us, looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why someone would be so angry about something meant to help her walk inside her own home. That was the moment my patience began to unravel. Rules were one thing, but attacking the very tools that gave my child independence was something I could never forgive. Karen walked away that night satisfied, clutching her clipboard as if it were a crown, but I knew this was only the beginning. Every rule she cited, every letter she wrote, every confrontation she staged was a test, a way to measure how far she could push us before we broke. For her, the HOA was more than a set of bylaws, it was her weapon of choice. And with each swing, she came closer to crossing a line that would change everything. What she didn't realize was that every attempt to control us was also sharpening my resolve. She believed she was untouchable, that no one would ever fight back. She couldn't have been more wrong. The first time Karen turned her full attention toward my wife, it was different, more personal, more venomous, and far harder to ignore. Up until then, most of her battles had been with me. She barked about her lawn, nitpicked over the ramp, complained about packages and chalk drawings. I could handle that. I had learned to let most of it roll off my back, reminding myself that Karen thrived on control and that taking her too seriously would only feed her need for power. But when she shifted her gaze and directed her anger at my wife, it crossed into territory I couldn't dismiss. It started small, almost unnoticeable. Karen began addressing her letters directly to my wife instead of to me. The wording grew sharper, almost mocking, as if she were intentionally singling her out. Failure to comply, consistent disregard, potential fines, phrases carefully designed to belittle, to imply incompetence. My wife read them with trembling hands, her voice cracking as she tried to joke about how ridiculous it all was. But I saw the way she folded the letters too neatly, the way she tucked them into a drawer rather than throwing them away. They weighed on her, eating at her sense of peace. One afternoon, while my wife was planting flowers in the front yard, Karen appeared as if summoned by the scent of soil. She didn't greet her, didn't even acknowledge her kindness or effort to beautify the neighborhood. Instead, she sneered and asked if she had filed the proper request for landscaping modifications. The tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory, dripping with contempt. My wife, patient as always, explained that she had chosen soft, non-invasive plants, and that it was only meant to brighten the space for our daughter. Karen cut her off mid-sentence, waving her hand dismissively as if my wife's words were meaningless. Rules are rules, she snapped, scribbling something on her clipboard before striding away. My wife stood there, shoulders slumped, her hands still dirty with soil, the flowers abandoned at her feet. It was the first time I saw her spirit visibly falter. But Karen wasn't done. She escalated further, showing up uninvited when my wife was alone at home. Once, she pounded on the door in the middle of the day, demanding to inspect the side yard for supposed violations. Another time, she cornered my wife in the driveway, shouting about the recycling bins being unsightly. My daughter was in the car, her wide eyes watching through the window as Karen raised her voice, pointing and gesturing wildly. My wife stood there, trapped, trying to stay calm for the sake of our child, but I could see the toll it was taking. She wasn't just being criticized, she was being bullied. The turning point came during a neighborhood gathering organized by the HOA. My wife, ever hopeful, baked cookies and brought them along, determined to show goodwill. Karen made a show of ignoring her, refusing to even taste the cookies, but she didn't stop there. Loud enough for others to hear, she mocked my wife's constant need for attention and muttered something about how some people think their personal struggles give them special privileges. The words hung in the air like poison. My wife's face flushed, her smile crumbled, and she excused herself quietly, holding back tears until we were in the car. That night, as she cried in our kitchen, I felt a fire ignite inside me. It wasn't just about letters or rules anymore. Karen had chosen to humiliate her publicly, to break her spirit, and by doing so, she had made herself my wife's tormentor. From that day forward, The air around our home felt heavier. My wife avoided going outside alone, fearing another confrontation. She spoke less about her plans for the garden, less about decorating for the holidays, less about everything that had once brought her joy. Karen's cruelty had stolen something intangible from her, the freedom to feel safe in her own space. Watching the woman I loved shrink under the weight of that harassment was unbearable. I knew then that we were no longer dealing with neighborhood disputes or petty control issues. Karen was escalating, testing boundaries, inching closer to outright violence. And though I didn't know exactly how, I sensed she was preparing for something far worse. The day it all happened began like any other, deceptively ordinary. The sky was bright, a clear blue stretched overhead without a single cloud to hint at the storm that was about to crash into our lives. My wife was outside, tending to the front yard with her usual quiet determination, while our daughter sat nearby on the small bench under the shade of the maple tree. She had her sketchbook in her lap, drawing uneven but joyful shapes with colored pencils, her braces glinting in the sun as she shifted carefully on the seat. For once, it was peaceful, one of those rare moments when the weight of therapy sessions, medical bills, and constant HOA harassment seemed to slip away. It almost felt like a glimpse of the life we had once dreamed about when we moved here. I remember standing at the window, coffee in hand, watching them with a kind of guarded relief. After weeks of tension, seeing my wife laugh gently at something her daughter said, seeing our little girl so focused and happy, it was a reminder of why we endured all of this. We weren't here for perfection or prestige. We were here to give her a chance at normalcy, to build a home she could feel proud of. But peace in Karen's world was always temporary. I noticed her before my wife did. Karen's figure appeared at the end of the street, walking briskly, clutching something in her hand. Even from a distance, there was a stiffness to her stride, a fury in the way her shoulders were squared, that made my stomach knot. This wasn't one of her usual patrols, clipboard tucked under her arm, looking for trivial violations. This was something different, more focused, more dangerous. My pulse quickened as I watched her approach, her eyes locked on my wife like a predator spotting its prey. At first, I wanted to believe it would be just another confrontation. She'd yell about the flowers again, maybe scold our daughter for leaving pencils scattered on the ground, and then storm off with her usual self-righteous flair. But the way she gripped the object in her hand, tight, deliberate, set off alarm bells in my mind. It wasn't a clipboard. It wasn't a letter. It was something darker, something I couldn't quite make out from the window. My wife, unaware of what was coming, bent down to water the flower bed, her back partially turned. Our daughter looked up from her sketchbook and spotted Karen first. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing, her small voice uncertain. "Mommy, why is she coming here again?" My wife straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, trying to keep her smile steady for our daughter's sake. She probably assumed it was another argument, another verbal attack to endure. She had grown used to Karen's constant intrusions. But this time, the storm was already on top of us. Karen reached the edge of our lawn, her voice cutting through the air before she even stopped walking. She shouted about violations, about how we had ignored the HOA's warnings, her words fueled not by authority, but by pure rage. Her face was red, contorted, her eyes blazing with something unhinged. My wife stood her ground, trying to remain calm, speaking softly so as not to scare our daughter. "Karen, please, we've done nothing wrong. You need to leave us alone." But Karen only stepped closer, spitting words like venom, her hands trembling around the object she held. That was the moment I recognized it. The metallic glint, the wires dangling from the front, it wasn't a clipboard or a phone. It was a taser. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and the coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor behind me. My first instinct was disbelief. How could a neighborhood dispute possibly lead to something so reckless, so violent? But disbelief quickly gave way to dread. I knew Karen had always been volatile, but this was a line I never imagined she would cross. I bolted for the door, but every step felt too slow, every second stretching into eternity. Outside, my wife had realized it too, her eyes widening as she finally saw what Karen was holding. She instinctively stepped in front of our daughter, shielding her with her body, her protective instincts taking over in an instant. The air was thick with tension, charged with the anticipation of something about to go terribly wrong. Neighbors once again peeked from their windows, frozen spectators to a disaster in the making. No one came out. No one called for help. Fear had paralyzed the entire street. And as I reached for the doorknob, heart pounding, I knew we were seconds away from a moment that would forever shatter the illusion of safety in our community. Karen raised her arm, her finger tightening on the trigger. My wife's face hardened, not with fear, but with the desperate courage of a mother protecting her child. And in that suspended instant, before the crackle of electricity split the air, our world teetered on the edge of chaos. The sound of the taser firing was like lightning breaking loose right in front of us, an electric crack that cut through the air with terrifying finality. For a split second, everything slowed, as if the world itself couldn't comprehend what was happening. Then, in an instant, the wires snapped forward, striking my wife with brutal precision. Her scream tore through the neighborhood, raw and piercing, as her body convulsed under the violent current coursing through her. She staggered backward, her hands clutching at the wires embedded in her skin, before collapsing to the ground with a force that seemed to shake the earth beneath us. Our daughter's scream followed, shrill and heartbreaking, a sound that no parent should ever hear. She dropped her sketchbook, her tiny hands reaching out in helpless desperation as her mother's body writhed on the pavement. The terror etched into her face was something I will never forget. Wide eyes brimming with tears, lips trembling as she cried out for the one person who was always her protector. In that moment, Karen hadn't just attacked my wife, she had shattered my daughter's sense of safety, leaving scars no one could see, but that would never fade. I sprinted across the yard, my chest on fire, my mind caught between rage and disbelief. Every step was agony because it felt too slow, too late. By the time I reached them, my wife's body was still jerking violently, the smell of ozone and burning fabric heavy in the air. Her face was pale, her eyes glazed with pain, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands moving instinctively to pull the wires free, to shield her from the current that had turned her body into a battlefield. My daughter clung to my arm, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the cul-de-sac like a siren of pure grief. And there Karen stood, taser still in hand, chest heaving as if she were the victim, her eyes flashing with self-righteous fury. There was no guilt in her expression, no hesitation. Only the cold satisfaction of someone who believed she had finally proven her power. "I told you," she shouted, her voice shrill, trembling with adrenaline. "You don't get to ignore the rules. You think you're special. You're not. Nobody is above this HOA." Her words fell like poison, absurd in their cruelty, as if electrocuting a mother in front of her child could somehow be justified by a set of bylaws. I wanted to leap at her, to rip the taser from her hand, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had inflicted. But my wife's gasping breaths pulled me back, anchoring me to the ground. I pressed my hand against her chest, whispering desperately, telling her to hold on, that she was going to be okay. My other arm wrapped around our daughter, pulling her close, trying to shield her from the sight, even as tears streamed down her face. Inside me, fury roared like a wildfire, consuming every shred of patience and restraint I had once held. Neighbors were gathering now, doors cracking open, faces peeking from behind curtains. Some stepped outside but stayed rooted to their driveways, too stunned or too afraid to intervene. I could feel their eyes on us, their whispers cutting through the tension like knives. But none of them moved to help, and none of them stepped forward to confront Karen. She thrived in that silence, in their fear, standing taller with each passing second, taser still raised like a scepter of authority. "Call the police!" One neighbor finally muttered, his voice trembling. But Karen snapped her head toward him, her glare so venomous that he quickly ducked back inside his house. She had built her kingdom on intimidation, and even now, after committing an act that should have horrified everyone, she wielded that fear like a weapon. My wife stirred faintly, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "I'm okay," she whispered, though the lie was written across her face. Her body was still weak, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Our daughter sobbed harder, clinging to her mother's hand, terrified that it would slip away from her. Watching the two of them there, broken and vulnerable, I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't just a feud anymore. This wasn't about HOA letters or chalk drawings or garden decorations. This was an assault, a crime, an unforgivable attack on the people I love most in this world. I rose to my feet, slowly, deliberately, every nerve in my body humming with a controlled fury. Karen's triumphant smirk faltered for the first time as I locked eyes with her. She must have sensed it, the shift in the air, the moment when prey becomes predator. She took a step back, but she still clung to her taser, trying to maintain the illusion of power. "Don't look at me like that," she snapped, her voice shaky now. "I'm the president here. I have the right to enforce the rules." Her words barely registered. All I could hear was the echo of my wife's scream, the sobs of my daughter, the sound of the taser cracking through the air. My hands clenched into fists, and for the first time, I stopped holding back. Karen thought she understood power because she held a title in a neighborhood association. She had no idea what real power was, no idea who she had just provoked. And as I took a step toward her, my voice low and steady, I made her a silent promise. This was the last time she would ever terrorize my family. The silence after my words hung heavy, charged, like the air just before a storm. Karen's eyes darted nervously, searching for the confidence she had worn like armor only moments earlier. But that armor was cracking. She still gripped the taser, but her knuckles were white, her breath uneven. For the first time since we moved into this neighborhood, she wasn't sure if she was in control. I stepped closer, slow and deliberate, my hands raised not in surrender but in restraint. I wanted her to see every ounce of fury I was holding back, to feel the weight of the consequences she had just triggered. "You think you can assault my wife in front of my daughter," I said, my voice low and steady. "You think your title as HOA president gives you that authority. But you've just made the worst mistake of your life." She blinked, a scoff escaping her lips, though it trembled with uncertainty. "Don't threaten me," she snapped. "I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood. You won't do anything," I cut her off. My voice thundered louder than I intended, echoing across the cul-de-sac. "Because right now, you're standing in front of a federal agent, a sworn protector of this country. And what you just did isn't a petty rule violation, it's a federal crime." Gasps rippled through the onlookers who had gathered at their doors, their eyes widening as the word sank in. Karen froze. Her jaw fell slack, her grip on the taser loosening just slightly. "You're what?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm a U.S. Marshal," I said, pulling my badge from my pocket with measured precision. I held it high, letting the late afternoon sun catch the shield, its gleam undeniable. Murmurs erupted from the neighbors, shocked whispers that carried through the air like wildfire. Some stepped further onto their lawns, finally emboldened now that the balance of power had shifted. Karen's face drained of color, her bravado unraveling before their eyes. She took a step back, her taser lowering as though it suddenly weighed too much to hold. No, you're lying," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You're just trying to scare me. You can't be," but the conviction in my tone, the badge in my hand, and the authority radiating in every movement silenced her denial. The weight of reality was crashing down on her. This wasn't a neighbor she could bully, or a family she could intimidate. This was someone trained to face danger, someone with the power to bring her actions under the scrutiny of the law she thought she controlled. I knelt beside my wife again, pressing the badge gently into her hand. She looked at it through teary eyes, her lips trembling into the faintest smile. Our daughter stared wide-eyed at the emblem, her sobs softening into hiccups as she clung to her mother's arm. That moment was for them, to know they weren't helpless, that they weren't alone in this fight. Then I rose once more, turning my attention back to Karen. "You tasered my wife," I said firmly, my voice steady but ice cold. "You traumatized my daughter. You did it in front of witnesses, and you did it while abusing the position of power this community trusted you with. That is assault with a deadly weapon. That is abuse of authority. And that, Karen, is enough to put you behind bars for years." She shook her head violently, stumbling backward, her voice pitching higher. You can't arrest me. This is my neighborhood. I'm the president of this HOA." Her words only made the neighbors murmur louder, disbelief spreading across their faces. Some even scoffed, shaking their heads, as if finally seeing her for who she truly was. The illusion of control she had clung to for so long was unraveling thread by thread. "You're not above the law," I told her, taking a final step forward until there was no space left for her to retreat. "And tonight, every single person here will know that justice doesn't bow to self-appointed tyrants. Justice bows to the truth." For the first time since we had moved in, Karen was speechless. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, her eyes flicking between the badge in my hand and the crowd forming around us. The neighbors who once cowered under her rule now stood straighter, their silence no longer complicit, but condemning. And in her eyes, I saw it, the dawning realization that her reign of fear was over. I didn't need to raise my voice again. I didn't need to touch her, or even demand she drop the taser. The truth was more powerful than anything else I could wield. And as I locked eyes with her, steady and unflinching, I knew she finally understood. She had picked a battle she could never win. The sirens came first. Faint at the beginning, a distant wail cutting through the neighborhood's stunned silence, then growing louder, sharper, until the flashing red and blue lights spilled across our street. For years, Karen had weaponized fear, convincing everyone she was untouchable. But now, as two patrol cars screeched to a stop in front of our home, her empire crumbled beneath her feet. Karen staggered backward, clutching the taser like it was her last lifeline. Her eyes darted frantically between me, my wife trembling in the grass, and the gathering crowd of neighbors who no longer shielded her with their silence. They weren't on her side anymore. The murmurs had shifted. People were recording, whispering words like assault, child, weapon. The officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters as they quickly scanned the scene. One of them, a seasoned sergeant with a stern jawline, immediately spotted my wife on the ground. "Ma'am, are you injured?" he called out, rushing forward. My wife nodded weakly, holding her side where the prongs had struck. Our daughter clung to her, eyes wide with terror. That was all it took. The sergeant's face hardened, his gaze snapping toward Karen. "Drop the weapon," he barked. The command cut through the air like a blade. Karen froze, her chest heaving. She shook her head wildly. No, you don't understand. She was violating HOA rules. I was enforcing community standards." Her voice cracked, desperation spilling into hysteria. "I'm the president of this neighborhood. I had to do it." The second officer advanced cautiously, his voice firm but calm. "Ma'am, this is not a discussion. Put the taser on the ground. Now." Karen's hand trembled, the taser wavering between clinging and surrender. For once, the power wasn't in her voice. It was gone, stripped away by the lights flashing against her pale face, by the cameras of neighbors who had once feared her, but now watched eagerly as her downfall unfolded. I stepped forward then, my badge still visible in my hand. "She assaulted my wife with that taser," I said, my voice carrying authority that the officers immediately recognized. "My daughter was present. There are witnesses. You'll find the prongs still in her shirt." The sergeant turned to me, his eyes flicking to the badge, then back to my face. "Marshal?" he asked quietly. I gave a single nod. That was all he needed. His posture stiffened with respect as he returned his focus to Karen. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and child endangerment. The words hit like a gavel slamming down in court. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's knees buckled, her voice breaking into a shrill scream. No, you can't arrest me. I run this community. She spun toward the neighbors, searching desperately for support. But the crowd's silence was deafening. No one came to her aid. Hands reached for her arms as the officers closed in. She kicked, thrashed, shrieked. You're all traitors. Every single one of you. You'll regret this. Her tirade ended with the snap of cold steel around her wrists. The sight of Karen in handcuffs, her once smug face twisted in panic, was something no one on that street would ever forget. The officers led her toward the patrol car, her protests devolving into incoherent pleas. It was just the rules. I was protecting the community. I didn't mean please, please, but her words fell flat. No one believed her anymore. I knelt beside my wife as paramedics arrived, carefully checking her vitals, gently removing the taser prongs. Our daughter wouldn't let go of her hand, her small body pressed tightly against her mother's. I kissed her forehead, whispering, "It's over now. She can't hurt us anymore." As Karen was pushed into the back of the squad car, the crowd finally found its voice. Not for her or for us. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now muttered things like, "It's about time," and she finally got what she deserved. A few even approached me, shame flickering in their eyes. One man said, quietly, "We should have spoken up sooner. We all saw what she was doing to you. We were just afraid." I met his gaze evenly. Fear is what gave her power. Silence is what let her grow. But that ends tonight. The patrol car door slammed shut, sealing Karen inside. She pressed her forehead against the window, eyes darting wildly as though searching for a way out. But there was none. For the first time, she wasn't the enforcer, the president, or the tyrant. She was just a criminal, caught by the very system she thought she could bend to her will. The officers drove off, the sirens fading into the distance. The neighborhood stood in stunned silence, the air heavy with the realization that a chapter had closed. Karen's empire of intimidation had collapsed, not with another angry meeting, not with another petty violation notice, but with handcuffs and flashing lights. I held my wife's hand as she was guided to the ambulance, our daughter still tucked close against her. My chest ached with relief, my throat tight, with emotions I couldn't put into words. We had endured so much mockery, harassment, fear, and in the end, it was the truth, the law, and a single moment of courage that shattered the chains she had wrapped around us all. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I finally believed it. Karen was gone. And justice had spoken louder than her cruelty ever could. The courthouse was colder than I expected, its walls lined with polished wood and heavy silence. The kind of silence that didn't just hang in the air, but pressed down on everyone inside. For weeks, the trial had been building momentum, gathering attention not only from the community, but from news outlets eager to cover the story of an HOA president gone rogue. By the time my wife and I walked into that courtroom, escorted by federal colleagues who had come to support us, every seat was filled. Karen sat at the defense table, a shell of the woman who once strutted through our neighborhood like a queen. Gone was the tailored blazer she had worn during her HOA meetings, the smug smile that had cowed our neighbors. In its place sat a disheveled woman, her hands trembling, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she could still will her power back if she held on tight enough. But power doesn't belong to bullies in a courtroom. Power belongs to the truth. The prosecutor began with calm precision, laying out the charges: aggravated assault, child endangerment, misuse of authority. Each word echoed like a hammer strike, chiseling away at the illusion Karen had once built around herself. And then the moment came. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, and the jury was shown what my neighbors had captured that day on their phones. The footage was raw, shaky, but clear enough to send ripples through the room. Karen's shrill voice, screaming about rules and violations, filled the air, followed by the unmistakable crackle of the taser striking my wife's chest. Gasps erupted from the audience. Some jurors flinched. Even Karen's own attorney looked down, avoiding her client's eyes. I felt my wife tense beside me, her hand slipping into mine as the video replayed. Our daughter wasn't in the room, too young to endure the trauma again, but her small cries could be heard faintly in the background of the recording. That sound was harder to hear than the taser itself. That sound was what truly broke the courtroom's composure. Karen's defense was weak, almost laughable. Her attorney tried to paint her as a woman overwhelmed by stress, a leader pushed too far by constant rule-breaking. But the prosecutor dismantled that argument piece by piece, presenting testimony from neighbors who confessed to years of harassment, intimidation, and threats. People who had once been too afraid to speak against her now told the truth under oath. One woman admitted she had been fined hundreds of dollars for leaving her child's bicycle on the driveway. Another man revealed Karen had once threatened to have his family removed if they didn't trim their lawn to her exact specifications. Each testimony built a tower of evidence so high that Karen's excuses crumbled beneath it. And then it was my turn. I took the stand, swore the oath, and looked directly at the jury. My voice was steady, though my heart raced with every word. I told them about my wife, how she had already carried the weight of our daughter's disability with unshakable grace, how she had endured Karen's endless cruelty without lashing back, how that taser had stolen more than just her strength in that moment. It had stolen her sense of safety. I told them about my daughter, her innocence, her resilience, and how she had looked at me with terrified eyes that day, wondering if her mother would ever stand again. And finally, I revealed the truth about myself. I am a U.S. Marshal. I said, my badge placed firmly on the table before me. I have seen criminals of every kind. I have seen men and women break laws, cross lines, destroy lives. But never did I imagine that the greatest threat to my family would come not from a fugitive, but from the woman elected to protect this community. The room was silent, the weight of those words sinking deep. The jury watched me, not as a government agent, but as a father and husband, a man whose family had been torn apart by someone's lust for control. When I stepped down, I knew I had given them the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The closing arguments came swiftly. The prosecutor's voice was sharp, unwavering. This case is not about HOA violations. It is not about rules or regulations. It is about abuse. Abuse of power, abuse of neighbors, abuse of a family. Karen sought to control through fear, and when fear wasn't enough, she reached for violence. That is not leadership. That is criminality, and it must be punished. The defense muttered something about emotional reactions and misunderstandings, but the words fell flat in the face of what the jury had seen and heard. When the jury left to deliberate, the room buzzed with tension. My wife squeezed my hand, her eyes searching mine for reassurance. I whispered to her, "It's almost over." It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide Karen's fate. My breath caught in my throat as the judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, the foreman said, voice steady, "We find the defendant guilty." On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. On the charge of reckless misconduct, guilty. The words slammed through the courtroom like thunder. Karen's face crumpled, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. The bailiff stepped forward, hand gently gripping her arm, as her attorney sank into his chair, defeated. The judge's gavel came down. "Karen, you are remanded into custody pending sentencing. Court is adjourned." And just like that, the reign of the so-called HOA queen was over. Not with another threat, not with another letter slipped into our mailbox, but with the law's final word, guilty. When the dust finally settled, when the courtroom lights dimmed and Karen was led away to face the consequences she had earned, there was an almost eerie quiet in my heart. For months, we had lived under the weight of her tyranny, never knowing what petty rules she would twist into a weapon, never knowing what day would bring her rage crashing down on our doorstep. And yet, As the gavel echoed its final strike, it wasn't triumph, I felt. It was relief. Relief that my wife could finally walk outside without fear. Relief that my daughter could draw in her sketchbook under the maple tree without looking over her shoulder. Relief that our home could once again be a place of peace, not a battleground. The neighborhood began to change almost overnight. The same people who once hid behind curtains when Karen prowled the streets now stood taller, freer. Families began talking again. Children played on sidewalks without worry, and neighbors who had once been divided found common ground in the ashes of her downfall. The illusion of her power was gone, and in its place grew something far more valuable: unity. For my family, healing came slowly, but it came. My wife, though scarred by the memory of the taser, found strength in knowing she had survived not just the attack, but the years of intimidation leading up to it. My daughter, resilient beyond her years, found her courage again in small steps, smiling more, laughing louder, daring to believe that home really was safe. And for me, the greatest lesson was not about law enforcement or authority or even justice. It was about courage. The courage to stand, even when standing meant being targeted. The courage to speak, even when silence seemed easier. To you, watching this right now, I want you to take this with you. Bullies thrive on fear. They survive on silence. And the moment you decide to stand, the moment you refuse to be broken, is the moment their power ends. You don't need a badge to defend your family. You don't need a courtroom to demand justice. You only need the conviction that what is right will always be stronger than what is cruel. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought fear would shield her forever. But in the end, her cruelty collapsed under the weight of truth. That's what I want you to remember. No matter how loud, how ruthless, or how relentless someone may seem, justice has a way of finding its voice. And if this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath, if you felt the anger, the fear, or the relief with us, then join me here. Subscribe, stay with this channel, and together we'll keep telling the stories that prove one simple truth. Bullies fall, but courage always rises.